Okay, I think, yeah, now it works. It was just, no, I'm telling you
So are
something.
you recording now?
Yeah, I'm recording now.
Okay, I'll record my local audio then, and I'll send you a file, and you can use that if you're putting something together if you'd like.
Perfect, that's better. Normally they have removed the Hangout record question, but I use just OBS. That's fine now. It was just on two different screens,
Sure.
and I want to look you in the eyes while talking with you. It's better than.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So, how long are we planning on recording for?
I was thinking we plan about like 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, and if it's a
Yeah,
good,
I should have time for 30 minutes. That's good.
and if it's a good conversation, I mean, we don't have to end it. And
Sure.
okay.
So, is this going on YouTube, or I'm trying to just remember exactly what?
Yeah, it's gonna be on YouTube. I have a channel.
Okay, cool.
It's called Freedom Lifestyle, which is very fitting because it's a lot about building up your own skill set. So of course,
Sure.
learning fast is something
Yeah,
very
yeah.
important when you build up your skill set. So thanks first for taking the time to do this podcast
Oh yeah,
with
no
us.
problem. No problem. Yeah, it'll be fun.
I've seen you have given a lot of people a chance to talk to you. You really value the exposure also, and thanks to be part of that.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so we can talk for about half an hour, so I think it should be fun.
Okay, perfect.
So I'm ready to go whenever you are.
Okay. Yeah. So first, you have wrote a book, Ultralearning, which is getting more and more popular. I feel the last couple of days, couple of weeks. I found about it with Blinkist, and I read the Blink and then the book after, which is something that rarely happens. But it's yeah. I mean, most of the books are not. You get the biggest lesson just by reading the Blink or reading like summaries. But ultra learning or like learning fast was also always something I was super interested in. I told you in my email when I was I got kicked out of school twice, so it didn't work for me at all. I did my A levels. It's called Abitur in Germany. It's like 11th to 13th grade, completely with self learning. And back in the days, it's almost 10 years ago. I read, like you probably know, Call Newport books, how to become
Of course.
and that helped me a lot. And since back then, it was always a constant struggle for me. Not a struggle, but something I was interested in, and I found there was not enough information out there that was talking about that, how to improve the slope of your learning curve when you learn new skills. And so I was very happy. I found another super great book. But how about you introduce yourself for a second and you summarize the book in like quick in your own words?
Sure. So, my name is Scott Young, and I recently published this book, Ultralearning. And so the idea of the book was to focus on how do you get good at the things that matter to you, and not just the kinds of things that are taught easily in school, but also the kinds of skills that really matter to your life and your career. And so throughout the book, I talk about a number of people that I discuss in the book are these people I call ultra learners, or people who take on aggressive self-directed learning projects. So people like Benny Lewis, who speaks 10 plus languages, people like Tristan Montebello, who within a very short period of time went from near zero experience public speaking to world championships, or Eric Barone, who sold tens of millions of his video game that he self-developed, mastering all the skills, art, music, programming, game design, all doing it by himself. And so I wanted to talk about some of these extreme examples to see what the principles are behind people who can pull these kinds of things off, so that someone who wants to maybe, get a better job, transition to a new career, learn a particular subject or skill or language, can apply those principles to be able to improve how they learn things.
Yeah, you just said things that are easily taught in school, and I very often think that school is like a way to teach that was made like 200 years ago or 150 years ago. And I don't feel like a lot of, especially with the attention span that people nowadays have, I don't feel there are things anymore that are taught easily in school because people don't have the attention span for it. You in your book are presenting it as a technique to learn something faster, but I even think that those approaches can be the base for like a new evolution of learning, because I don't feel the learning that's the majority of what is happening right now is in any way efficient. On the one side, it's not. Most of the stuff that is taught is not really useful on the job market anymore. What you're also saying in the book, and second, it's not the most efficient, and they are not using the tools and the science behind learning any good. And also, I mean, there are a couple of reasons you can go on a lot about. What do you think about the learning culture we are having in the world right now?
I think that you're probably right on some points there. I think that my feeling is that a lot of our assumptions that we have about how people learn things best are often wrong. And so I talk about some of the examples in the principles of the book, things like directness, which is that we have known now from studies going back really over 100 years that people tend to learn things in quite specific ways, at least in the beginning when they start learning something. And this has a lot of implications for the education system, because what tends to happen is that you teach someone something in a classroom and then they're unable to transfer that thing that they've learned to real world context or real world situations where a teacher, someone from the outsider, would say, well, they obviously should be able to make that transfer. And so that's worrying, because the kind of way that we want to teach things in school is to teach very general purpose, general ideas. And if that isn't how people learn most of the time, if people tend to learn things quite specifically and they learn in very specific contexts, then that is worrying, because schools have to face this trade-off where if they teach things that are too specific, then they're teaching only to a very, very narrow group of people and applications. If they teach things that are general, it might not transfer, or at least it might not transfer if we don't take these sort of preventative steps to really allow that to happen. And again, a lot of the evidence seems to be that that's not happening in schools. Or other things like retrieval is another instance where a lot of students in particular have this idea that most of the learning takes place while they sit in the classroom and while they listen, whereas we also know that there's a lot of it is actually happening when you do tests or when you do practice. And so this is something that's also a bit of an adjustment for people to make, because how many students just reread their notes over and over again when that isn't super effective for actually creating long-term knowledge.
Yeah, that was one big thing for me while learning the doing tests. Like 80% of my learning back in the days might not be completely perfect, but it was just like doing old tests. And even though I like created myself and I made like 14% right, but just like the curiosity that happened, I mean, who am I telling this?
Doing a retrieval practice and self-testing is so important, and yet students often don't do it. And it seems to be that there's a mix of reasons why that is. One reason might be that students, so one of the studies that I talk about done by Jeffrey Karpicki and Janelle Blunt, showed that students are somewhat overconfident. So when they do the kind of just reviewing your notes, they tend to feel very good. They feel like they've really learned it, but then they tend to perform worse on tests than if they had just tried to practice closing the book and remembering as much as they could. And so this sort of undue confidence that comes from this can lead us astray, lead us to use ineffective studying methods. But then there's also maybe the fact that doing this kind of retrieval practice, doing the work that has to go into learning, is hard. And so if you don't have a very strong motivation or very strong rationale for why it works, why do the hard thing? Why not do the easy thing? And so what I've also found is that students often try to shy away from these things that actually work because they're more effortful and they require more effort. And so this is also sort of the kind of trade-off that I was trying to highlight in the book with the theme of ultra learning, is that you can learn more effectively, but the trade-off tends to be that the things that are more effective are usually also more effortful. And so you don't usually get this free lunch where you can do something that's super easy and you'll just learn everything magically. But if you're really serious about it and you really want to learn that language or programming or get really good at something, you can do it, and there are more effective strategies, but they also work because they're harder.
Yeah, I feel also though that is a skill that you can learn. Like I always talk about it as like work ethic, and to be in this immense pressure once for when I learned like 3 years of school in 2 months while having a full time job,
Mm.
um, I I hadn't had the time to look on my phone. Like I really had to do dedicated 8 hours lessons, and I have to say when I look back, that taught me so much just because I've been through this once. So now I have a way easier time to focus into something. And in the beginning, it's very tough. And when I look like when I go to the university and see people studying there, most of them are never getting into the deep work state, like where they really focus. What you're also talking a lot, and the skill. I think to come back to what we talked before. I think the skill of learning is probably. I don't know. I would even say it's more important than any other subject in school at the moment because um, all the challenges that companies face nowadays and the skills they are looking for, they are they are way more valuable than they are, and it's changing so fast that you cannot what you learn in school you cannot it will not get you through work even if it's like super new what it isn't in university. It will maybe help you 2 years and then there's something new, and if you are not able to learn a new skill then you're just fucked and you will be just like you,
Yeah.
that's the reality what I see of all my I'm see all my friends that come from university. They have super high diplomas and had good grades and everything, but they don't outperform on the job market. It's just a sad truth. So when I'm talking about university, I have another question to you. So you did the whole MIT computer science course that is supposed to be 4 years on your own at home in 12 months, which is an congratulations and an astonishing achievement, of course. But I have a slightly critical question. So, of course, the MIT diploma is a very nice way of showing off what you have learned, and it's a has a high reputation. But do you think that the computer science course they are providing is even the best way to learn computer science? If you don't
Well, yeah.
you,
Keep
you,
going.
you, you get my point. If you don't think about the
Yeah.
reputation or how much is it worth, just if you want to learn the same skill.
No, that's a very good point, and that's I think I've made that point myself because I think that it really depends on what your goal is. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about that what we've learned about learning is that it tends to be quite specific. And it tends to be quite specific in terms of its application as well. So if you really spend a lot of time learning something, knowledge does tend to generalize a bit more. You do get more transfer. But at the same time, at that crucial beginning stage, which really for most things, that's where we are. We're near the beginning of learning something. And so because of that, you have to be very careful about what you're trying to accomplish and really think critically about that. And so, I mean, I did my particular challenge in part because I didn't really have the idea, okay, well, I'm going to be using this in, trying to get a specific type of programming job. It was just, I wanted to learn this subject, and that's totally fine. But I think in the same sense, if your goal was to become, let's say, a web developer, you could focus your curriculum much more focused on web development and focus on very specific tools for that. Or if your goal was to do machine learning, for instance, you could do a different thing. And so I do think that the MIT courses tend to be fairly good, but they also tend to be fairly math heavy in a somewhat unnecessary way for programmers. So I think that can somewhat be an obstacle to really learning from them because the expectation is that you're going to learn calculus, linear algebra, a lot of advanced mathematical things, which are not really necessary for most programming. Machine learning and some of these advanced things are a little bit of an exception, but if you're trying to build a website, you don't need calculus, and that's one of the courses taught. Similarly, MIT, they have a joint electrical engineering computer science program. So I did a lot of classes that were in the electrical engineering stream, and those are also, even in other computer science programs, not considered necessary. So things like circuit diagrams and with resistors and inductors and capacitors and these kinds of things. This is also not something, this kind of electronics education is not really, in most computer science faculties, you're not learning that either. So I would say that there's some divergence in topics. So depending on what you were trying to do, you could probably eliminate most of the classes I took and learn just what you need to learn. But at the same time, I think there's probably a benefit from pursuing projects from a little bit more of a hands-on project-oriented perspective. So one of the projects I documented in my book was Trent Fuller's STEM Punk project, which was STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And he did a project which was similar in its kind of broad aims as my MIT challenge, but instead of like, I'm going to try to emulate a degree, which was sort of my kind of unofficial benchmark, his idea was he's going to pick four, I don't remember the exact areas he chose, but he picked four kind of areas related to math and engineering, and then he did projects around that. And so you can check out his effort there. And I think that from a hands-on practical perspective, that was probably better than my project was for acquiring those skills. But again, I think the thing that I want to convey to people who, not only listening to this right now, but might be reading my book, is that this is a very important question that can't be skipped, is where do you think you're going to be using the knowledge and what kinds of things are you trying to do with it? And even if you don't have a very, very specific idea yet, I think that it's often good to start asking those questions earlier, because for many people, if you spend lots of time learning and then later you're like, okay, where can I use this? You're not nearly going to approach things in the same way as if you knew off the bat, okay, well, I want to build a startup, or I want to build a video game, or I want to get into machine learning.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's the biggest kind of hack that you can do to shorten your learning time. That you just just learn what you need instead of going super broad. And I was having this struggle quite a couple of times with coding, where I was thinking, I mean, I never did like a big coding class. Like I never did like a 10 hour class. I mean, I read something there, I read something there, I did the coding game, and then I started to do projects, and I was always feeling sometimes, maybe I have done too less basics. But on the other side, I kind of went through, because to be honest, I just maybe George Halls, the guy who coded the self-driving car on his own, and I saw him doing neural network for chess, live coding, and I was seeing he's googling the same amount as we are probably googling when we're coding. I mean, to be honest, like coding is, you will never learn everything, and there's the kind of techniques you will learn them while doing them. So probably it's the same as for the test. The way you remember it is way better when you apply it actually, because you have a story around it. And
I would be to be more specific about what I actually think about this, because I do think that theory and abstract ideas and general concepts are valuable. So I don't think that the way to view what I'm trying to argue here is that, well, we shouldn't learn any theory and we should just only learn things just hands-on. I think it is valuable to learn theories, especially because often a theory allows you to make sense of your experiences that would have taken you hundreds of hours, or maybe even a whole lifetime of trial and error, without realizing, oh, this is the general principle, or this is the thing. So even my old book is organized around general principles rather than just step-by-step guides. So I think there's definitely some irony there if I were arguing that we shouldn't learn any general principles or any theory. I think rather what I'm trying to make as a point is that even when you learn the general principles, it really helps if you know what concrete situation you're trying to tie them down to in the beginning. So if you are learning about, one of the things that you would learn that would be a theoretical topic in computer science would be algorithmic complexity, which, all things being said, just basically means if you have an algorithm that runs in exponential time, it's going to be super, super slow. And so you're often trying to find ways that you don't have to do that, or you can make it so that you don't have to check things. If it's n squared or n, that's going to be a big difference. And so this is a very abstract idea that you are probably not going to encounter if you just code and you don't learn any theory. But at the same time, when you're learning it, if you know that your eventual application is you're going to be trying to create a video game, or you're going to be trying to create a machine learning algorithm, you can start connecting it to that situation. You can start working on your projects and be like, okay, well, what is the running time of this particular algorithm, and why does that matter, and why does that impact the things that I'm seeing? And so I think it is important to learn theory. I think it is important to learn big ideas. And I don't think that's the problem of schools. I think that they teach these big ideas because they are useful. I think the challenge is just that when you are just taking the class and it is removed from, well, where are you actually ever going to be using this? Then there's a disconnect. So you learn it over here and then you have to apply it here, and there's no highway connecting the two. So I think it's very important to lay that highway down in the beginning, to lay that connection point, so that, yeah, when you start learning about algorithmic complexity, you're seeing it in the projects you're doing, you're applying it there. And if you're just learning about it in abstract and you never apply it to a project, it's going to be a lot harder to use that knowledge in a useful way later.
So you would say it's more about finding the guidelines and the theory that is important for what you're trying to achieve, if I get you right.
I think that, again, as I said, there's a separate issue here of whether we want to learn a lot of theory versus learning a lot of things that are quite specific or from the ground up, so to speak. So from hands-on experience only. And I think that there's a place for both of those. So I'll give a good example, because one of the projects I did was a portrait drawing project, which I talk about in the book. And this is a really good example because both of those factors came into play. And so I think it's important to keep in mind the whole time I was doing this project.
One thing, just before you keep this, I just want to give like my amateur view, how I would see it, because I think that can make your point even better. Like I would think portrait drawing is just learning. Like it's just like I would just think I just start drawing and I don't know. Like I wouldn't think there's a lot of theory involved. But yeah, now keep on. How did you approach it?
Sure. Yeah, so drawing a face, this is a good example. Okay, so there's both ends of this. So on the one hand, one of the things that was key to the project is I was drawing a lot of portraits. And I think that's the thing that I'm saying that is often missing in an academic situation, is that maybe you're doing homework, maybe, but even then it's often very dissimilar to where you eventually want to apply it. So you're doing a programming class and maybe you do a little like code here or there, but you're not doing the thing that you actually eventually wanted to do, which was, let's say, building a video game or doing something like that. Or a language learning class, even better example, where you sit and you memorize vocabulary, but you're never actually having a conversation with someone in a way that is where you actually want to get good at in that skill. And so that leads to these transfer issues. But so the portrait drawing challenge, I'm drawing portraits the whole time. So that's not an issue anymore. Like everything I learn is going towards this purpose. But on the other hand, there's two different directions that you get the knowledge in. So one of them is bottom up, and that just simply comes from doing a lot of it and getting feedback. And so some of that is a little bit like riding a bicycle, that it's not really an entirely conscious, oh, I'm making this kind of mistake and let's do this differently. You're just doing it a lot and you just get better from doing it a lot. So there's this kind of unconscious and conscious bottom up. Sometimes it's a conscious effort as well, where you draw a face and you realize, oh, I keep making the face too wide. So I'm going to correct for that next time. I'm going to try to draw a little narrower. I make this mistake of drawing it too wide. Maybe that's just an example you have. Or I tend to do this mistake. Let's try to correct that. So these are all bottom up, meaning that they come from my own experience. They come from doing the work and interacting with it, and maybe trying to solve little micro problems as you encounter them, kind of like, oh, I made this mistake last time. Let's not make it next time. On the other hand, there's a sort of top-down theory perspective, which is getting tools, ideas, principles, these kinds of things that allow you to not make as many mistakes. So for me in that particular project, I took a really useful course, which was taught by Retrieval Studio for portrait drawing. And they have a whole method for how do you go through step by step to drawing a face. How do you sort of plot it out so you can achieve high levels of accuracy? There's no way I would have been able to get to the place that I eventually got with that skill if I hadn't been taught that theory, if I hadn't been taught that method. If I had just been doing it a lot, I would have stalled out at where I was. So you need to have that kind of union of both, right? You need to have the bottom-up experience from concretely, I'm trying to solve this problem and I'm just trial and erroring things and learning from that experience. But then you also need from the outside ideas, principles, theories, methods, and they can come from all sorts of places. The difference is not whether it's coming from the bottom or from bottom up or the top down, but whether where they meet in the middle is actually related to the thing that you want to get good at, or whether it's somewhere completely different. So I think that's an important distinction.
I think in the book you call that meta learning, where you kind of find out how it's the best way to learn your specific skill, and there might be differences in the theory that is best and the practice that is best, like the percentages.
Meta learning is like an additional layer on top of that. So there's sort of again, like you can learn a concept or an idea, but then you can also learn what are the best concepts and ideas to learn. So there's sort of an extra layer removed from that. So when you're doing something like portrait drawing, you can go online and look up how do people get good at drawing portraits, and you will not only get a lot of courses and ideas, recommendations and methods. So you'll have some sort of broad overview of, okay, these are the things that I could use. But you'll also see what people say about how the skill breaks down. Like, how does drawing, quick sketches differ from sitting someone and spending 6 hours to draw it? Like, those are very different skills. And so that's something that you might not be aware of when you go into it. You might think that the same things that make someone good at drawing a sketch are the same things that make them good at drawing something for 6 hours. And it turns out they're not. That you need different tools, because if you have 6 hours to do something, you can do a completely different method than if you have 60 seconds. And so that's true for a lot of things as well. Like programming, for instance, you might not even be aware that there's a difference between object-oriented programming and functional programming, or you may not be aware that there's these differences. And so you do some of this meta learning to kind of see how is the topic structured, what are the resources you can use. And then that also helps you decide the right ratio of how much theory and method do you want to learn versus just doing it and just learning from your own trial and error. And there's a balance there as well, right?
Yeah, I think, for example, I'm right now trying to learn chess because I really enjoy it, and it's
that's a great example.
Yeah, and I think that's quite on the opposite side compared to portrait drawing, because when I was looking into the forums and talking to people, how's the best way to get better, then actually one of the worst things is to play a lot of fast chess. So you should basically play the slowest chess, and which basically increases the time you do theory, because the more time you have to think about each move, the more you will learn. Also, there's like, to get better, there's probably 70 to 80% of studying to compared to actually playing. So the moves you do is very, very low, actually, let's call it practice, compared to something, for example, a portrait drawing, where it's a big part to do the practice. And but what you said is, in everything both is involved, theory and practice, and you have to figure out, correct me if I'm wrong, you have to figure out what is best for your specific skill, what you want to achieve, and then from there, what are the best methods to get both of them.
So you bring up a really a good point, and I think this is important to point out, that there's a difference between the speed at which you're getting feedback, or let's say we're talking about chess. You mentioned that one of the not recommended strategies is to play lots of fast chess. And so playing lots of fast chess does allow for more feedback. You're going to get feedback more quickly than if you play slow chess. The disadvantage, however, is that you're not allowed to invest that much thinking into any particular move. And there does seem to be this sense that for a lot of skills that there's a slow to fast transition. So you need to first be able to do it well slowly before you can do it quickly. So if you're trying to play a piece of music, the key is to be able to first be able to play it at a much lower tempo and then do it faster. Yeah. If you just try to play it fast in the start, you're just going to have a mess. Now, this is a kind of a nuanced topic, so I don't want to say that that's just generally true, but this seems to be probably true for a lot of skills where you're trying to make incremental improvements, because it's a little bit like what I talk about in drill, right? So there's a technique that I talk about in that chapter called the magnifying glass method, which is essentially this, which is that if you want to get better at some skill, giving yourself more time to perform it can allow you to focus on sub aspects of that skill that you're maybe neglecting. So again, one of the things, if we're looking at chess, there might be a lot of things to think about in the position. What are the different lines of play, and how am I trying to play? Am I trying to play aggressively, defensively, positionally, tactically? Am I looking for a trick? Am I looking for just making incremental improvements in my position? All these different types of factors are coming into play there. But if you're playing bullet chess, you don't have time to think about it. You just make moves. And so I think that there's a lot of times when that is a way of taking a really complicated skill and just stretching it out. So if you were, again, drawing a portrait, that was one of the things that helped me, was switching to this more painstaking method, because just doing much faster and faster, it hit diminishing returns after a certain point, after you kind of learn the kind of simple lessons. So maybe playing quick chess would make sense to just get a general sense of the game. And
actually, like in the first when you just learned the rules of chess, after that it's suggested to do a couple of quick games, so you get a little bit of a feeling for it. But it's in the very early stages.
And these are important trade-offs to consider. But this is what you said, like when we're talking about meta learning, that if you go in and you research how do people get good at chess, you already have a wealth of like, well, people have tried doing bullet, people have tried doing slow games, and the slow game seems to be sort of the more popular strategy. If you want to look into learning languages, you will see lots of different opinions being shared, but you'll also see that like people who are good at learning languages, like none of them recommend Duolingo, which is so even there you already, maybe you don't know exactly what the best strategy is. So I know there's a subset of people that really like doing a lot of input. They like listening and reading.
I have done Duolingo for Spain, and I am not able to speak it properly, even though I finished all of it. So yeah.
Well, yeah, and I talk about it in the book that I'm not a huge fan of Duolingo because I think that it has transfer problems that make it unsuitable for a lot of conversation practice. It might ironically be the thing that it seems to be best at is probably reading, but that's probably not what they're using.
Yeah, but reading Spanish isn't that complicated anyway.
But I mean, even reading Spanish was not, like, again, if you were like reading something, I don't know, I don't even know how. I haven't tried the Chinese version, but I've also been told that it has some defects. But I think that's an example of where you don't always, when you do your meta learning research, you don't always know what the best strategy is, but you know what some of the bad strategies are. So don't do this, right?
Yeah,
and
probably
you may have to experiment a little bit, but you know which things to avoid.
I think you named the number of about 10% of the time of your whole map should be meta learning. And I had sometimes the problems also, especially for chess, when we stay there, you can, like, there's a saying in chess, people in chess students spend more time to study how to study chess than to actually study chess, because chess has such a wealth of information out there. And so that's actually quite another problem sometimes, where there are too many routes, and in coding you call it decision paralysis, where you don't move on because you can't decide what is the best way. And at one point you just have to kind of flip a coin and just do something, because one or the other will always be better than getting the micro.
The whole idea of kind of mastering this learning thing is also making decisions under uncertainty, so that you don't know what the right move is to make. So you do something and then you get some feedback from it and you try something else. So I've done lots of things in my learning projects that turned out to not work very well, and I still do. So it's not the case that you ever totally rid yourself of any inefficiencies. I think the right thing to do is that you want to be able to quickly learn from your mistakes. And also, you have some mental model of how learning works, so that you avoid things that are obviously bad, if you make mistakes, they're usually because, well, there was something you weren't expecting that turns out that's why that doesn't work very well. So I'll give, some of the examples of things that I've done in the past that I've made mistakes for. With language learning, I remember learning Chinese, and I was really struggling with learning the characters in the beginning, or not just the characters, but just words in general. And the normal way I had for memorizing vocabulary was, there's a mnemonic I talk about in the book called the keyword method. And it works well for European languages with each other, because they tend to be somewhat, I don't know what it is, whether there's just similar root words, but even
they all come from a Latin base, I think.
It's a bit easier to say, oh, this sounds like this other word, so I can remember it that way. Yeah. I don't know why, but just when I'm learning like another European word, it tends to be much easier to do that.
It's because they all have a Latin base, I think.
Sometimes they have similar bases, so like creativity is that in Spanish. But even when they don't, even when it's, like morning is mañana, like they're not the same. So you're not going to say morning and think mañana, but at the same time, Mañana you can like, well, it sounds a little bit like banana or like something like this, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you're learning Chinese, well, all the words not only sound very different from English, they also sound very similar to each other. So if
Yeah.
someone says, well, morning is Zhao Shang, for like, okay, and then now you've got another word, like, also doesn't this also mean that and this? So it was getting very confusing, and I had like this idea of creating a more elaborate mnemonic system. Totally failed. It was a bad idea, but it was came from a good place. It came from an idea of, okay, I'm struggling with remembering these words. Maybe I can invest in creating a different mnemonic system. Now it turns out that wasn't super helpful, and that the right way of going forward was just to build through enough exposure the repetition from the foundation that you can start to do that from the beginning. But it was a good idea. It was at least like something that could have plausibly worked. Whereas there's a lot of strategies that just are clearly not going to work. Like, I'm going to read over my vocabulary list again and again and again, and you can eliminate those safely. But you don't always know what the best strategy is when you start a project, even after you do your research.
Yeah, but one point you have to decide. I have extended our time already a bit.
Sure.
I just want to come back to one thing you said before, from learning skills slowly. This is something I just picked up recently when playing a computer game where you had to learn motoric skills, right? And there was a specific like training path, and I did it like when I was trying to get better. I did it every day, and I tried to be faster. It was like time, right? And I couldn't get any faster. And then I stopped trying to be faster, and I tried to do not make mistakes. So just press the right keys, the right motoric, at the right order, and I didn't focus on being faster, and I became automatically faster. And that kind of taught me something. Also for typing, if you want to become faster in typing, I mean, of course, after learning 10 fingers, it's better to focus on not making mistakes than to make faster, because when you try to be faster, you will make more mistakes, which will not really, it's barely improving. And I remember I think in Malcolm Gladwell's book, it was not in Blink, in Outliers. There is a famous Russian tennis academy that brought more top 10 players in the 90s than any other tennis academy. And what was their secret also was to do things like they had one court only and like 20 to 30 students. And so you cannot even really play tennis there. But what they did were they were practicing the movement like to perfect it in a very, very slow way, like ultra slow. Like they just had to do like their backhand and forehand in like a very, very slow way. And then there was like this Russian teacher who was correcting them. Yeah, go a little bit more swing. And though they had got such good swings, and it was also like they had the movement done perfectly slow. And I think there are more examples out there where doing things slow is really kind of a big hack to learn motoric skills. And I don't have to learn that motoric skills in work, but when I applied this for like my computer work, so I'm trying now to learn always the best way to do it, which is most of the time a shortcut. So if I'm using a new program, I'm directly looking what is the shortcut. And so I'm using more and more my keyboard instead of my mouse, even though in the single instant it would be faster to use my mouse. But over the long term, it will be faster if I just remember not the position where it is, but I remember the key, the shortcut, which will be easier than after I've done 200 times it with the mouse. And I actually need it more often. So let's learn the shortcut now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's lots of these little things. I think that's one of the things that makes the kind of learning how to learn so interesting, is just that there's so much detail and little nuance and stuff. So there are some general principles, but of course, every little thing that you want to learn has its own little tricks and its own little process for it. So I try to approach things from that kind of big view of like, hey, what are the big pieces that need to be in place? But then I always go into it with an open mind about what are going to be the little things that are going to change that. So things like, what's the right speed to do this? Like you said, is speed versus error correction. I find that for me at least, it depends on what we're doing, but often for language learning, I do the opposite approach, that when I'm trying to speak a new language, my goal is to maintain a fluent rate of speech as opposed to error-free. And this somewhat prevents the kind of pausing and stuttering over words constantly when you're saying sentences, that it's better to just say it like 90% correctly. Although it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? So that if you're trying to say something and you have to say it perfectly accurately, then you have to, do more and more repetition. So there's lots of these little trade-offs, and that's what part of what is enjoyable about doing this and doing these projects is that it's not always clear exactly what the right path is going to be. But if you have the framework of, okay, I know I'm going to have to do some of these sorts of things, and I don't know which one is going to be the right thing, you're at least at the starting point. You're at least at the place where you can start experimenting.
Yeah, I think to finish this up, we really just touched the surface here of what you're teaching, what you're teaching in your book. There are so many different things to learn. There's so many different techniques, and so many, like, that's why you need the roadmap. And there's also things that we haven't touched here. I mean, we could probably talk for hours and hours to talk all through the method. So I suggest everybody to read the book, because that's actually like the real kind of guideline how to apply it. I cannot even, like, there's like how to get clear mind. We haven't talked about arousal levels. We haven't talked about really about recall versus review. I mean, we've touched it slightly, and also there are a lot of good examples of stories in there that might be motivating, that might people to get started. I just want to add one thing. What I really like is, I don't know what you think about it, is like also writing a journal when you're doing a project like this. So you kind of
absolutely.
You kind of have a feedback of your journey, which can help to motivate sometimes if you struggle to motivate like over a longer time, and you see, like 2 months ago
I think
I was
it's
just
useful to step back and think about your process. I think often we're doing things and we don't approach things from that meta level where we're looking at, okay, but what is the process for doing this? And I think that can often be a good way of dealing with frustrations and difficulties itself, because sometimes we deal with these things emotionally, so we're struggling and we just feel frustration, and it just takes a little bit to step outside of yourself and be like, okay, this is not going exactly how I wanted. What might I be able to change to make it go the way I want? I think is a useful sort of distancing step. Even if you decide, no, this is the right approach, let's keep going, it's often useful to consider that, because otherwise you just keep getting frustrated that, like, oh, this is so hard, I'm not doing it. Whereas you're like, why am I not remembering this? Or why don't I understand this? Or, okay, maybe this is my issue. And so I do that always in projects. And so I highly recommend other people do it as well.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of like journaling and I had a lot of like projects, and I always performed 10 times better when I had a journal. So thanks for your time.
Thank you.
I hope we talk again another time, maybe with your next book or whatever. Other than that, I wish you all the best with your book, and talk to you later.
All right.
Bye.
Care.